Bible up front. So we got all, in fact, I even skipped some of it because we could have done more, but I feel like everybody got the point. I mean, basically the point is east and west is west, and the twain shall never meet. So going beyond that, I know that I think I see Kirk has it too, and Marty, you have it. If you have my little booklet that I've written on Christian Zionism in the past, then a really important chapter that I wanted to get to last week, but you can just read out of for yourself, is chapter 3 in that, which is on the topic of Zionism and the oral law, which in it, because last week there was technically a gigantic sort of bridge, if you will, that was left uncrossed. And so you could be asking, well, you spent a lot of time talking about religious Judaism, but what on earth has that actually got to do with political Zionism? Because they are two entirely separate things. And in chapter 3 of my booklet, which I was hoping to go through in this class, but I'm not comfortable spending too much time on topics away from the scriptures in a Bible study. So anybody who is curious can ask me independently or look through my booklet or just do some Google searches. But through several individuals, the most popular of which would be the person of Moses Hess, political Zionism is inextricably linked with religious Judaism. Moses Hess lived and wrote primarily from about 1835 to about 1860. His real name was, I don't know, Moshe Hessenpfeffer or something like that, but he always wrote under the name of Moses Hess. And he was actually a contemporary and a good friend of Karl Marx. He actually wrote the first draft of the Communist Manifesto. Marx would later rewrite it a little bit, but let's see, yeah, the Communist Manifesto is Marx and Engels together. So Marx and Engels would later kind of rewrite it, but Moses Hess actually threw out the first draft. And most importantly, Moses Hess wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem. And Rome and Jerusalem is generally considered to be the playbook that was followed by later Zionists, such as Theodor Herschel and Moses Montefiore and Chaim Weizmann, when they began actual political Zionism. So, Theodor Herschel is usually considered to be the father of political Zionism, but I think I even have a sentence in my booklet that says something along the lines of Herschel reaped the harvest from the seeds that Moses Hess had planted, or something like that. And that's basically the truth of it. And Hess was a rabbi. Hess was an Orthodox rabbi. And anybody that asked me last week, I probably recommended a book by an author named Alexander McCall, a book called The Talmud Tested. And McCall's labors as a missionary to the Jews had been fairly successful. He understood the Talmud so well that McCall had not only evangelized, the Jews are typically, the Jews are the most difficult non-Christian group to evangelize. Like, they're very difficult historically to evangelize. When they do have converts, a lot of the times their converts become quite powerful Christians. Like, for instance, in the medieval era, Johann Pfefferkorn was a rabbi who was converted to Christianity. Pfefferkorn went on to be a serious, almost early Protestant, kind of a spirit of Reformation, a lot of famous debates with the Roman Catholic Church, wrote a couple of important books and tracts, and is generally looked at as a little bit of almost an early Protestant. He was in Spain, I think. So, some Jewish converts in history, when it does happen, they oftentimes make powerful Christians because they're usually very intelligent folks. But so McCall's labors in Poland and Eastern Germany had rendered some Christian converts, and then even more so, he had contributed to the beginnings of what became the Reform movement within Judaism, which was something of a liberalizing from the rigors of Orthodox Judaism. So like the religious things we talked about last week out of the Talmud, the Jews, even though they didn't necessarily convert away from their beliefs on the whole and convert to a different religion, began to abandon a lot of the rigors of the Talmud. And McCall was partly responsible for that. And he wrote in the early 19th century, and then Hess came along in the middle part of the 19th century. He was very put out by the Reform Jewish movement. And so he had a lot of not nice things to say about Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, if you will, whatever. And so, he had statements in his book, Rome and Jerusalem. He said things like, the true Jew is only the Jewish patriot, the one who believes in reconstruction of a national existence, ending the diaspora amongst the Gentile nations and forming our own nation wherever that may be. Just of some note, I always find this interesting, and in closure on this topic, Moses Hess himself, like I said, probably the early middle 19th century father of a Zionistic idea in politics, had no affinity for any particular piece of land. The later Zionists, such as Montefiore, Weitzman, and Herschel, tend to favor Zimbabwe, actually, which I think is interesting because they were fairly friendly with the French Empire and they were curious if the French would give them Zimbabwe. They also at that time approached the United States if we would sell them part of Texas. So, so the Zionist movement was not overly committed to the land of Palestine at its start. There were, let's see, I want to say that it was Moses Montefiore that eventually convinced them to go for Palestine because, you know, in their own cynical fashion, had some conversations around the fact that they could probably get Christians to give them money if they played it as kind of like a last crusade kind of thing. So early Zionism didn't necessarily have any sort of religious affinity towards, you know, Abraham's land or anything like that. They most seriously considered Zimbabwe and attempted Zimbabwe throughout the 1930s. And then it wasn't until the Balfour Declaration, well, I shouldn't say as late as the 1930s, it was earlier than that. It was much earlier than that because the first Zionist Congress was, I think, 1891 or 1892. So, you know, the Zionist Congress in the 1890s went on for like 20 or 30 years, suing both the British and the French for some place where they might colonize. And Zimbabwe was their earliest target. And then in 1918, you know, I don't want to say in 1918, it was the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration was all part of, you know, the ending of World War I, the English Empire. You know, at that time, they didn't necessarily have full control of the Middle East because there was the Ottoman Empire to contend with. But then when the Ottomans surrendered unconditionally at the end of World War I, England came to rule over the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, basically. So with that, then, you know, everything from what is today Egypt and Iraq and Syria and parts of Iran and all of Turkey all fell into the British hands. You know, and so they now all of a sudden had civil authority over this land where before they'd only had some trading agreements and made a few martial expeditions. So with that came the Balfour Declarations and, you know, all those sort of promises that got made in a whole bunch of different ways, which we still feel the ripples of today because the British Empire didn't necessarily understand that all of the national boundaries in the Middle East fall along racial lines, and you can't exactly play with those. Because those tribes have lived where they live for a long time. And when you try to chunk them into various political administrations, it creates a lot of war. And they didn't help that by throwing the Jews in there because the Jews don't actually play nice with others in civil context either. And the natives didn't play nice themselves. Like nobody's really ever played nice in those situations, which, I mean, we don't do a whole lot better ourselves, but we do at least historically have had the mediating effect of you know, Christianity, which none of the Muslim peoples there or the Jews have. So, you know, kind of created a giant problem there with the collapse. The Ottomans weren't nice people, but the Ottomans did understand how to make the empire work. They did that for, you know, 1,000 years, and they weren't interested in seeing their own subjects butcher each other. So the British generally handled that less tactfully, messed up the lines on the map, and then decolonized in a supposed act of kindness in the 1960s and left the world to fight it out until, I don't know, eventually somebody will either step in and rule with an iron fist, you know, and stop just saying we're fighting wars for democracy, and they'll just say, no, we're going to just rule this thing and y'all can all just shut up, or everybody will leave it alone and they'll fight with each other until they sort it back out like it had been. But this sort of halfway station of we're going to come wage peace and fight for democracy hasn't been that effective since the 1960s. So anyway, that's a little bit of a backstory on the link between political Zionism and religious Judaism through the persons, particularly of Moses Hess. So getting on now to point 2 in our study, we're going to look at the fact that the church is a unified body in history. And this is an important point to Christian Zionism because Christian Zionism hinges on the dispensational idea that the Jews were God's chosen people in a former dispensation and the church is God's chosen people in this dispensation. And I want to challenge that idea. That idea is contra all Christian thought ever. And it's not supported by the Bible. So it has two massive factors against it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to turn to several New Testament passages. And if you're familiar with dispensationalist writings, which is, Christian Zionism pretty much only exists within the confines of dispensational theology in the 20th century American church. The dispensational teaching is that the church started at Pentecost. Up until Acts chapter 2, there was no church. Before that, there was the nation of Israel. And then, if you're familiar, I'm most familiar with like John Hagee as far as dispensational teachers go. I've had a MacArthur Study Bible, which I'm pretty familiar with. John MacArthur, to his discredit, generally teaches somewhat along these lines. Also, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, Henry Ironside, Cyrus Schofield, his study Bible is not as popular as it used to be. But all these guys are going to teach you that the nation of Israel was God's chosen people up until Acts chapter 2. And then from Acts 2 on, you have the church. And so they're trying to sort of draw this dividing line, which I want to go through scriptures and show is not correct. Rather, just upfront and boldly put, the correct view of the church is that the church has existed. The church is the body of believers, and it's just that, right? You get into scientific studies of divinity, and you have the church triumphant is the church of those who are already dead and in heaven. The church militant is the church still struggling on this earth. The church visible are those who profess the faith. The church invisible are those who are actually regenerate, because not everybody who professes the faith is regenerate. And then you still have another category, because there are some people who are currently alive and unregenerate, but will come to profess faith. And because, of course, God knows all this, they, in a certain sense, make up part of the church, even though they're not yet part of it, because they haven't come to a profession of faith. So it gets a whole lot more confusing if you really get into the nuts and bolts of it. But the very simple partition of it is that the church is always those who profess the faith. So like, for instance, the church started on day 6 of creation when Adam and Eve were created, because they worshiped God. And when you see a calling to worship God, you see the church, because the ecclesia, as the term is in Greek, we're probably all familiar with this, it's pretty basic stuff, but the ecclesia is the congregation which is called out, or the group that is called out. So sometimes in the Old Testament, it just appears as the congregation. But the full context of ecclesia in the Greek is the people or the group or the congregation that is called out or set aside to God. So the church, in its spirit, began with Adam and Eve, creation. And then, just in the same way that the family started with Adam and Eve. And then in a particular sense, where we're going to turn to in a minute, is in Genesis 17. The church really as an institution really begins in Genesis 17, because God comes to Abraham and he sets forward particular rites, right? Like up until that time, you'd seen some sort of sporadic priestly behavior. There's all sorts of legends about the person of Shem. And then, of course, we have actual biblical material about the persons of Enoch in the antediluvian period, and then we have the very clear recordings of Melchizedek in the post-diluvian period. So God seems to have instituted some sort of religious rites amongst particular individuals who acted as priests for mankind, but we're not left to wonder anymore when we come down to Genesis 17, because God particularly sets forward to Abraham that Abraham is to walk before God, he's to do a few certain things, not do a few certain things, and he is to have, for all the men in his camp, the sign of circumcision as the religious rite of entry into the visible church. So the visible church as an institution is formally established in the household of Abraham. That is the contention of every stripe of Christianity down through the ages. And the New Testament everywhere assumes this. So to prove that, we're going to turn to 3 passages, which is convenient, because I'll have each one of y'all read one of those. Marty, if you want to read Matthew 18, 15 to 17. Matthew 18, 15 to 17 is our least convincing text, but remember, we are talking about assumptions here. And then Philip, if you want to look up Acts 7:38, and Kirk, if you want to look up 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 6. Oh, well, Philip, if you don't have, I forgot, you don't have a smartphone to look it up on. I'll read it so that way. 10, 1 through 6. Acts 7:38. Yeah, Marty, anytime you get there.
All right.
Matthew 18:15-17.
Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between you and him. If he shall hear you, you shall gain your brother. But if he will not hear you, then you shall then take with you one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let it be unto you as a heathen man and a publican.
Right. So, here we have Christ. This is, in the midpoint of his ministry, a good full year before Pentecost. And Christ does not speak of the church as any new institution. To our written knowledge, as recorded in the Gospels, he's never given the apostles any instructions on how to sort of set up the church. Rather, he's a teacher in the synagogues, which just means the sanctuary. He's a teacher in the sanctuary. His apostles are in the, that sort of whole Jewish religious system that is the sanctuaries. It's a time of great reformation with Christ's preaching in the synagogues. They have their own specific elder system, which is exactly what Christ is talking about in Matthew 18. And so he doesn't give them any elaborate instructions on, this is now the church, this is how the church begins. He just assumes the church's existence here well before Pentecost. And he says, if you have wayward brethren, go and tell it to the church. After you've confronted them individually, if they're obstinate, then you bring this before the church. And of course, by that he means, the session of the church government, so that they can act with the authority that is invested in them as church officers. But he assumes the existence of the church, which I think these other two texts are more convincing. But Philip, if you want to read Acts 7:38.
This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai. And with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles.
Right. So the second, right there at the beginning of what you read in Acts 7:38, then Stephen, preaching to the Jews, describes Moses as the one who was in the church in the wilderness. That word congregation. There is the same Greek word ecclesia for church. So that word can be translated either way. It's the exact same word. So Stephen, preaching there after Pentecost, says that Moses was a leader in the church in Mount Sinai, at Mount Sinai. So Stephen everywhere assumes the antiquity of the church. And Kirk, if you want to read 1 Corinthians 10, 1-6, it's going to say the exact same thing.
Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them, God was not well pleased. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted.
Right. So Paul is there using the Old Testament church as an example, and he says they partook of the same spiritual meat and the same spiritual drink. And what is, as Christians, as the church, what's our spiritual meat? What's our spiritual drink? Exactly. It's Christ. And he says they there partook of that. You could make more elaborate arguments that are in reality more convincing, but take a long time. Like you could have a whole Bible study on passages like Hebrews chapters 8-10, where the author of Hebrews calls the establishment of the church as it exists in the New Testament not a formation, but a great reformation, implying that it was a reformation in the preaching of the church due to Christ's advent. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is another excellent text where 2 Corinthians 3 speaks of the great likeness of the two testaments, the Old and the New Testament. And it says that the New Testament is greater in power. It doesn't say that it's different in power because salvation was always through Christ. Salvation was always attained by acceptance into the church through the work that was done by Christ and Christ's priesthood. The difference is that in the Old Testament, it was a down payment on promises. In the New Testament, it is exercised in the power of a reality of what actually is. So what we're trying to say is that the church has always existed, at least since day 6 of creation. It's existed as an institution since Genesis 17, when God instituted it with the household of Abraham. And we're going to turn to those texts in a minute to read it. We're going to turn to those texts in a minute to read it. But for finishing my thought there, the church has always existed. It's existed as an institution since Genesis 17. And it exists today not in fundamental difference, but in greater nature of power. Because the preaching of the church in the Old Testament was only on promises of what was to come. And it was only in types and symbols of what was to come. But now the reality of the symbol has been recognized. The antitype of the type has come, and we no longer work in promise of payment, but rather in power of what actually is. So the church is now capable of exercising greater power and authority on this earth than what it was, because the actual work of Christ has come and has been accomplished and is being accomplished. But there's not a fundamentally different administration, if you will. The church has always been the church. Ecclesia in any age means the congregation which is called out to the Lord. So that's the same whether it's Abraham's family, whether it's the person of Seth and his children in Genesis chapters 4 and 5, Noah and his sons on the ark was the church. And if you're familiar in 2 Peter, Peter makes that illusion that the ark with Noah on board was like the church, containing the 8 souls. So the New Testament knows nothing of the idea that the church began at Pentecost. The church began to exercise a power and authority which it did not have previously at Pentecost. We don't want to downplay Pentecost. When we study a whole lot of the stuff we talk about, when we talked about the exaltation of Christ and the study of the larger catechism questions pertaining to that, when we talked about Daniel and the zenith of Daniel's prophecies in Daniel chapter 9, and it's speaking of the things Christ would accomplish, the application of Christ's accomplishments to the church, and the realization of Christ's exaltation, all of those things are consequent with Pentecost. So we're not downplaying the effect of Pentecost, but to say that the church predates Pentecost is not downplaying Pentecost. That doesn't really have anything to do with it. And so the idea that the Jews were the people of God up until Pentecost, and then the church became the people of God after Pentecost, is seeking to find something in the scriptures that aren't there. I'm going to turn here to a passage in John Murray's Systematic Theology and read a couple of pages on the unity of the church in all ages. And this is what Dr. Murray has to say. I think this is helpful. Dr. Murray says that any inquiry as to what the New Testament means by the church, or he gives the Greek word ecclesia, cannot be biblically conducted without taking into account the Old Testament background and preparation. Our Lord and his apostles constantly appealed to the Old Testament for support and confirmation of their teaching. And not only so, but also used language which is derived from the Old Testament as the medium for conveying some of their most significant statements. The term for church occurs frequently in the Greek version with which the New Testament writers were familiar and from which they most often quote. That is to say that in the Old Testament, which was used by the Jews in that day, which was the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word church occurs in the Greek Old Testament that Christ and the apostles themselves used hundreds and hundreds of times, which our Old Testament translations may be superior to the Septuagint. I'm not going to argue it one way or the other, but I think it would be helpful if we did have the word church just right there in the Old Testament every time the Old Testament typically uses the word congregation. Because that's when the Jews themselves translated the Old Testament into Greek, which was their popular tongue at that time, the Septuagint translation, then they themselves translated that word as ecclesia. So their word for church, ecclesia, occurs in their Old Testament lots and lots and lots of times. Murray continues. To suppose that the frequent use of the term church not exercise a decisive influence upon the New Testament writers would be contrary to all practical thought, which is to mean that exactly what I just said. They assumed the church is existing in the Old Testament. Yes.
Is that the same word that they use in the New Testament in the third chapter of Revelation?
Yeah, exactly. Writing to the churches. Exact same. Yeah, because there was no difference in the context. When the Jews spoke of the churches, they spoke of the synagogues, because the synagogue means the sanctuary. And when we speak of the church, we're technically meaning the same thing.
Well, they use assembly a lot of congregation, assembly.
Congregation, assembly, church, synagogue, it's all the same thing, basically. What it has, church particularly is a word that can be used in a couple different ways, like we already talked about. You can speak of the church triumphant, the church militant, the church visible, the church invisible, so on and so forth. The church Catholic, the church local. But the term the church, however it's specifically meant, includes within it all of those various usages. And so what Murray here is saying is that that term really occurs from Genesis to Revelation. We sometimes don't always look at it that way, because in our English translations of today, we've translated the Hebrew word for church in a couple of different ways, and then we've translated the Greek word, ekklesia, generally as church. So in the Old Testament, when you read things like the congregation or the assembly or whatever, you don't necessarily make the connection in your mind. But like in in Deuteronomy, over and over again in Deuteronomy, it says, Moses gathered the people before him. That's the church. The gathering of the assembly, that's the church. So when the Jewish Septuagint translation has Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where Moses is giving these sort of great orations to the people, then it just says Moses gathered the church and they heard him, so on and so forth. So yeah, it's the exact same thing. Revelations, the Gospels, Paul's epistles, all the Old Testament. The same Hebrew and Greek words there all can duly and properly be translated as church. So Murray continues, and he says, the Hebrew term corresponding to the Greek is Hebrew word, and this Hebrew word is regularly, though not always, rendered in the Greek as church. The first instance in the Septuagint of the word church is Deuteronomy 4:10. Let's look up Deuteronomy 4:10. I'll do that real quick. I didn't necessarily do all my homework here. Let's see. Murray says that the term church is first used in Deuteronomy 4:10. I feel like I should know what 4:10 says. What does it say? Deuteronomy, okay, here we go, 4:10. Forget not the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather the people together. Okay, so this gathering together here that we see in Deuteronomy 4:10, the original language word that occurs there is the church. Okay, so you're looking for the church. Remember, my contention is that the church began in Abraham's day, at least as a visible institution. Here's Moses, some about 400 years later, not quite that long, but roughly there. Yeah, roughly 400 years later. And what does Moses say? Or God says to Moses, gather the church. So if we're assuming that the church is beginning to exist as a visible institution all the way back in Abraham's day, it has to exist in Moses' day. This certainly predates Pentecost. And in Deuteronomy 4:10, God commands the people to gather together the church. All right. The Hebrew word here does not have the corresponding noun in this instance, though it does have the verb, meaning to assemble or summon the assembly. Now, perhaps the most pivotal passages in the Old Testament are Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 10, chapter 10, verse 4, chapter 18, verse 16. All three of these speak of the day of the assembly. The assembly, or the church, is the covenant people of God as gathered before him. Here are some other passages where that word is used. And just to drive home the point, let's look up a couple of these. So let's see, Marty, you want to look up Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 10? I'm not going to look up all of them. He gives like 15 here. I'm going to look up a few of them. Marty, you look up Deuteronomy 9:10. Kirk, you want to look up Deuteronomy 18:16? I'm going to look up 1 Kings 8:14. We'll go through these couple, and then we might come back around. He gives a bunch.
And the Lord delivered unto me 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God, and on them was written according to all the words which the Lord spake with you in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, in the day of the assembly.
Yeah. Or as Murray is saying, that's in the Septuagint, just translated as the day of the church. All right, Kirk, you want to look up 18:16?
According to all you desire of the Lord your God, or in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or let me see this great fire anymore, he said that.
What verse was that?
It was 18:16.
I'm going to read 1 Kings 8:14. But before I do, just to turn our minds back to Acts chapter 7, verse 38. When Stephen, preaching to the Jews, says Moses was head over the church in the wilderness, would it be any great consternation or confusion to them to hear him speak that way when they, in their day's translation of Deuteronomy, were reading in all these places the day of the church in the wilderness? Right? And the two passages y'all just read, both in Deuteronomy, are Moses speaking of the church in the wilderness. So when Stephen preaches that way, then it's not going to be some new idea to them. Right? He's simply saying Moses guided the church in the wilderness. We read him say literally that in Acts 7, but that's not some confusing idea to them, because all he's doing is looking back to these exact verses that we're reading, and in their rendition of the Bible, which they had translated and must have been pretty good because Christ, who was infallible, quoted it. Christ quoted that translation of the Bible. He was using the Septuagint translation of the Bible, so it does give it pretty good credence. And they're translating those passages that we're reading as the church. I'm going to read 1 Kings 8:14. That says, the king turned his face and blessed all of the congregation of Israel, for all of the congregation of Israel stood there. And that's a very good passage because that uses that exact word twice in 1 Corinthians 8:14. This is King Solomon dedicating the temple. King Solomon's day, the church is definitely there because it says that he turned to face the church and all of the church was assembled before him. I have some other passages we could turn to, but I mean, I think at that point you get the idea. Moses presided over the church as a priest and a prophet. Solomon, as a civil leader, made a prayer before the church and the dedication, of turning over the temple as a civil construction to the, he's made a work of civil construction. He's turning that over to the priesthood, and so he assembles the church before him. John Murray gives about 10 other passages that we could look at, but I think we all pretty much get the idea there. So
chapter 8's got assembly and congregation all peppered throughout it.
yeah, exactly. So everywhere that you see that, then the Greek Old Testament, which the Jews use in Christ's day, which is called the Septuagint, had the word church or ecclesia, which is the word that they used for the church. So the idea of the church and the usage of the word church certainly did not begin with Christ or the apostles, and it did not begin as an institution at Pentecost.
What's the title of that book?
The one that I'm reading here, this is just John Murray's Systematic Theology. Yeah, this is one chapter in it. It's called The Nature and Unity of the Church. I have a duplicate of it right here because it's so good. I've been wanting somebody to take this and read it. Yeah, yep. Yeah. Anytime. Yeah. So, absolutely. Y'all might have to fight over it. All right. So I'll continue. I do have a couple more pages here because this book's very useful. Murray continues and he says, it is this concept of assembly summoned before God as God's own possession from among all peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, which there he's quoting from the Bible. And he continues with another quote from the Bible. He says, it is this concept of the church as the people which I formed for myself, that they might set forward my praise. More quotes from Scripture. It is precisely these same terms that Peter takes up when he describes the church. And I'm gonna just skip that little bit because we're gonna actually go to Peter and read that in a few minutes and further confirmation of what we're talking about. We have the most express identification of the existence of the church in the days of Moses and the preaching of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. We've already talked about that. The assembly of God's people is not a passing phase for Israel's history. It is never ephemeral, that is to say temporary or passing away. The references which we have already looked at and more that we could go into make plain that church was a permanent feature of Israel's identity. And he now sets forward to quote several passages from the Psalms. Let us turn to these, because these, I think, will help us to understand a couple of things, and something that I always like to talk about. Marty, if you would look up Psalm chapter 22, we're going to read from Psalm 22. Let's read verses 22 to 25. Philip, since you've got a Bible there, let's look up Psalm 35:18. Kirk, if you want to look up Psalm 49, Psalm 40, verse 9. These are good ones to look up. I like these, so let's look these up and take the time. So, Marty, whenever you get there, Psalm 22, verses 22 to 25.
I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In this congregation will I praise thee. Yea, that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye, the seed of Jacob, glorify him and fear him. All ye, the seed of Israel. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither hath he hid his face from him. But when he cried unto him, he heard. My praise shall be of thee in the great congregation. I will pay my vows before them that fear me.
Right. Now, this is something that I always talk about. The Psalms are the worship of the church eternally. Right? I mean, David wrote the Psalms down, but we don't even know that the Psalms began with David. It very well could be that the Psalms pre-existed David and he was the first one to write them down. We don't know. But either way, the Psalms have been the consistent recourse of worship of the church for 3,000 years now. So when we sing Psalm 22, or read it or pray it or whatever we do with it, I like to do all three of those things. But when we use Psalm 22, and David says, I will proclaim thy name in the midst of the great congregation. He's using the word church. He says, I will proclaim your name in the church. He's literally saying, I will set forward your will unto the salvation of men. I mean, it's for one, it's a parable of Christ, right? Christ says, the Spirit of God is upon me to preach the acceptable day of the Lord. David is saying, I will set forward thy name to my brethren. So there's allusions towards Christ, but it's also useful as the words of the church. The church can really say these things, right? When you come together in the worship of the Lord in the sanctuary, in a real strict idea of worship on the Lord's day, I will declare your name in the sanctuary. The church can say this today. Any day the church can say that. The church has always been able to say that. The church could say that in Adam's day. The church could say that in Noah's day. The church as an institution beginning in Abraham's day would have men who were dedicated to the priestly service who could say that, right? Moses could say that. Moses actually did that. Lord, I will declare your name in the midst of the sanctuary. David, inspired by the Holy Spirit, wrote that. The church has sung that in every generation from David's day on down. So when David says, I will stand up in the midst of the church and set forward your name, O God, this is not something that's temporally fixed. He's not talking about his own day in particular. He's not saying, this will be true up until Acts chapter 2, or, Pentecost will come and things will change. So eternally, it can be said, Lord, your name will be glorified in the midst of the church, because that's what he's literally saying. So the Psalms to me are amazing proof of exactly what we're talking about, because the church's worship is one in every age. The Psalms were so prophetic that I forget exactly who it was. Oh, it's in the apostles. It's in the gospel, right? Luke says that David in the Psalms called him Lord, right? Luke records that. It's in the Gospels. David in the Psalms calls him Lord, right? So the Psalms, every psalm speaking of Christ, David calls him God, calls him Lord. So we use the Psalms for worship. David used the Psalms for worship. The church in every age uses the Psalms for worship. And he's talking about the church, and the word church appears literally right there. Tangent of mine anyway, but let's see. Philip, go ahead and read 35:18.
I will give you thanks in the great congregation. I will praise you among the mighty thrones.
So same exact thing. Kirk, 49, chapter 40, verse 9.
I have proclaimed the good news of righteousness in the great assembly. Indeed, I do not restrain my lips.
Exact same thing. I'm going to read.
Lord, you yourself.
Okay, there you go. Sorry to cut you off. I thought you were done.
I was. I had the other stuff underlined and didn't have that underlined.
Very good. I'm going to read chapter 89, verse 5. Psalm 89, 5 says, O Lord, even the heavens shall praise thy wondrous work, yea, thy truth in the congregation of the saints. And then even though Murray does not cite this particular one, I'm going to turn one of my favorite Psalms, which is Psalm 122. And Psalm 122, verse 1 says, I rejoiced when they said to me, we will go up to the house of the Lord. Right? And that's not necessarily a literal one, because the idea of the house of the Lord it's not the word that Murray's working with here, but it's the same exact idea. All of these Psalms are saying, I will praise thy name in the church. Thy name will be exalted in the church, so on and so forth. The church, the church, the church. It's endlessly just setting forward the idea of the church. The church is not some entity that is foreign to the idea of the psalmists. Okay, the church existed in their day. If you take the church away from them, what on earth are they talking about? Because they're saying the church. When we translate in the New Testament the idea of the church, we're talking about the congregation. That's the word in the Greek that exists. Go to the Old Testament, the Hebrew, exact same word here that they're talking about. I'm glad to hear the people saying, let us go up and join the congregation. Lord, your name will be exalted in the congregation, so on and so forth. That point's pretty clear, I think. So I have a little bit more from Murray here, because I like Murray for this reason. Murray is one of those theologians you're never left wondering where he's coming from. He gives you his biblical material, and he gives you the words and the originals that he's working from, but it's in a way that, a simpleton like me can follow along and understand it, which is very helpful. Murray continues, the tabernacle was the focus of the assembly of the worship of the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 29, verses 42 to 46 is the one passage more than any other what the tabernacle signified and epitomizes what were the central features of the covenant relation. God meets with his people and speaks to them. He dwells among his people. Both are signified and certified by the glory. God is their God. We cannot but see the expression here of what is central in the covenant blessing throughout its entire history and coming to its consummation in the new covenant. Let's see, anybody?
Exodus 29.
Yeah, Exodus 29, 42 to 46. And you want to go ahead and read that. Right, because this is extremely important. We saw Solomon address the church when the temple was dedicated. Okay, and even though we don't necessarily have a verse that uses that exact word, Moses, of course, addressed the church when the first tabernacle, the one that was made for the travel of the people in the wilderness, because Moses was over the church in the wilderness. So we know the church was in the wilderness. Stephen told us that. And we know that they had the tabernacle because this is Exodus in the wilderness. So, Kirk, if you want to go ahead and read Exodus 29, verses 42 to 46.
This should be a continual burnt offering throughout the generations at the door of the tabernacle meeting before the Lord. For I will meet you to speak with you. And there I will meet with the children of Israel, and the tabernacle shall be sanctified by my glory. So I will consecrate the tabernacle meeting and the altar. I will also consecrate Aaron and his sons to minister to me as priests. I will dwell among the children of Israel and be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. I am the Lord their God.
Right, so you see the promises that God makes to them. This is a great privilege. Even though the priestly offering of sacrifices was a lot of labor, it was a great privilege to the people, right? God says, I will meet with you. I will sanctify you. I will set forward rites which you may perform that will allow you to live in my presence and to know me. Okay, this is a great privilege for the people. And ultimately, Christ has taken this work upon himself. As we talked about earlier, these priestly ministrations in the tabernacle was only a type and a symbol of what was to come in Christ's finished work. But God came into the midst of the people. He came into the church, into the congregation, and performed this great work that we see in the tabernacle. Marty, you brought up Revelation earlier. Turn a little later in the book of Revelation. Let's read Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. Read that verse with the promises that God makes to Exodus 29 in your mind. So when Marty reads Revelation 21, 3, let's be thinking about what we just read from Kirk there in Exodus 29.
And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them and be their God.
Right. So in Revelation chapter 21, which is where we finally have the utmost completion of the promises that are made in the Old Testament, where the mountain of the Lord will be exalted over all the earth, Isaiah 4. Habakkuk 2, the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, so on and so forth. The entire earth and the church will be a unity. The church will cover the earth. Every person on earth will be part of the church. At that time, we see that the imagery of the tabernacle is re-invoked. But the imagery of the tabernacle was always pointing towards the church, because the church is the congregation of God. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. That's Psalm 46, which is, drawing allusions between the church and the temple or the city of God itself. Right? So constantly, throughout the history of divine revelation, then we have the idea of a people who are called out, or a church, and God is in the midst of them. That's the promises of Revelation 21, Psalm 46, Exodus chapter 29, Genesis 17, on and on and on. A unity of the church in history. And I'll continue here from Murray. It is this same basic conception that obtains in the messianic passages, and we can have no doubt that these determine the direction in which we are seeking the meaning of the most significant statement regarding the church given by our Lord himself. I think particularly here of Psalm chapter 22, I will declare thy name unto mine brethren, in the midst of thine assembly will I praise thee. Psalm 40, verses 9 and 10, and some of the other passages which we have already read in the Psalms. Passing on to the New Testament usages respecting the word church, it becomes apparent that the notion of assembly or congregation is in the forefront. There are non-ecclesiastical usages of the term church scattered throughout the book of Acts. Here the meaning is obvious. There are sacred usages of the word church. These occur more frequently, and they also refer sometimes to particular churches, such as the one in Jerusalem, or Antioch, Ephesus, Cenchrea, Corinth, Laodicea, Thessalonica, etc. In accordance with this particularization of the church, we have manifold references to the churches. There are the churches in Cilicia, the churches of Galatia, the churches of Asia, the churches of Macedonia, the churches of Judea, and the 7 churches of Asia. Not only so, but Paul can speak inclusively in the plural, and he can speak of all the churches of the Gentiles, all the churches of Christ, the churches of God, the churches of the saints. The particularization or generalization of the idea of the church becomes most accentuated where Paul speaks of the church in a house, such as Romans 16:5, or the church on this earth. Here, therefore, is plurality, and all that is comprised in the church of God, denotatively considered, can be spoken of as the churches of God, or the church of God, or of Christ, or of the saints. Thus concluding what I had to say from Murray. Murray makes that last paragraph that comes across as somewhat confusing. And of course, in the New Testament, you'll run into places, for instance, John, in the text that Murray already brought up, John writes in Revelation saying, I write unto the church at Laodicea. But then in other places, we read that there are churches in Laodicea, because of course, John addresses the entire church in Asia as 7 churches. Now, of course, we know that there were much more than 7 sanctuaries in Asia. And the reason that he does this is, and Murray is stressing this because, of course, Murray is a Presbyterian, so he's striking home at the idea of Presbyterian church government, where multiple local congregations or legitimate churches federate together as one church under a presbytery. This is how the New Testament letters are addressed to the churches. This is how the church addressed itself in its own letters through most of its history. So in making that point against Congregationalist or Episcopal church government, which wouldn't necessarily speak the same way, Murray's making the point that Paul can write to the church at Corinth, even though there might be 50 churches at Corinth. He can speak of the church in the house of Ananias and Sapphira, or then he can speak of the churches in Rome, but the meaning is the same. These are the congregations of the saints, right? So he's kind of making a sub-point there, but after going through those verses, you get my idea of what we're speaking about, right? Which is that the church has existed, at least insofar as divine revelation has existed, because divine revelation, the Bible is what I'm talking about, is the special property of the church, right? So the church has really existed since God began giving man revelation, which was with Adam and Eve. But it was particularly set forward. The next thing we're going to start to look at here is Genesis 17. But the church was particularly set forward as an institution, at least in the days of Moses, right? Because with Moses, we see church being used as a word over and over and over again. But we're going to contend that it begins particularly with God's visitations to Abraham. But is any questions, thoughts, or comments on the antiquity of the church? That's what we're trying to verify here, is the antiquity of the church. So, I mean, I think that's a fairly open and shut case of that. Actually, you can do this. You don't want to like convert yourself to Roman Catholicism, but if you get, the Roman Catholics usually use a Bible that's a little bit different than ours. If you get a Catholic Bible, then like for instance, Catholics don't use the King James Bible, but if you get a Catholic Bible, their Old Testament, you have to get an older one. I forget. I have one at home because I wanted to do this. But if you have to have the right edition. But up until fairly recently, the Roman Catholics always used the Bible where the Old Testament was the translation from the Septuagint. The Protestants usually use the Masoretic text. The alternative to the Septuagint is the Masoretic. So our Protestant Bibles are generally translated. The Old Testament comes from what's called the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text of the Old Testament will usually translate into English using, "I will worship thy name in the assembly," or "Moses gathered the congregation together," or so on and so forth. But if you have an Old Testament that uses the Septuagint, then it's just going to say, "The church was gathered before Moses," or "I will praise your name in the midst of the church." And so, although actually even the chapters and verses line up a little bit differently, this is something you have to be wary of. If you're reading Catholic scholars, when they cite places, particularly in the Psalms, then the chapters and verses very rarely work out. So, like if you're reading a Catholic scholar and he's talking about the Psalms and you go to look up his references in your Bible and you're like, well, he's misquoting this. It's because in the Septuagint, the Psalms in some places are in a little bit different order. So that everything gets out of whack. Once you get, I think the first one that's out of order is in the 30s or 40s, but there's a couple of them. But once you get past just one of those, any link to the Psalms is going to be broken. It's the same way their book of Daniel has a few verses that ours doesn't. Their book of Ecclesiastes has a few verses that ours. Maybe there's a few wild editions, yeah, because they accept some of the apocryphal stuff. But yeah, so you have to be careful of that if you're reading Catholic scholars. Sometimes their chapter and verse links don't work out the same way ours do. Kind of weird, you think like Bible studies are Bible studies. When you get into it, there's this whole different, like their Bible's kind of different in one ways. But anyway, in some ways, their Old Testament is a little bit more instructive when you read things like that. And it just says the church. That's very simple. And I like the Septuagint for that reason. Now, we're all very accommodated to the Masoretic Old Testament. The Masoretic is considered to be a little bit more scientifically accurate. I mean, maybe not. I don't know. It's what we all study. I think it's fine. I'm not a scholar in these things, so I can't say. I'm not going to try and bulk established wisdom. But the Septuagint is what Christ himself quoted. So you can't go out there saying, oh, well, the Septuagint's wrong. Christ himself didn't use it. So it has some verification. And it's kind of helpful. It's kind of cool to read through that in these passages. So if you ever see one around, pick it up because it's pretty cool. But like I say, don't convert to Roman Catholicism through reading the apocryphal stuff. But all right, the next passage that concludes our point A. I was rambling a little bit there at the end. That concludes our point A. Our point A here was that the New Testament verifies the antiquity of the church, and then we read through John Murray's passages, which took us through a lot of Old Testament stuff. So we're well on our way with point 2 in our overall study, which is that the church is a unified body in history, not beginning at Pentecost. So now we move on to subpoint B, which is that the church began to be in the Old Testament. We've already talked about this extensively now at this point because we read from Murray, but I have 2 specific verses which I want to look up. I'll read those myself. Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 to 10. I'm going to read Genesis 17, 1 to 10 on the proof of the idea that the church, as a visible institution, began to be in Old Testament times. And here we go with Genesis 17, beginning in verse 1. When Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am God all-sufficient. Walk before me and be thou upright. I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, Behold, I will make my covenant with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. Also I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and will make nations of thee. Yea, kings shall proceed of thee. Moreover, I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give thee and thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, even all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Again, God said unto Abraham, Thou also shalt keep my covenant, thou and thy seed after thee, and their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you, and thy seed after thee. Let every man-child among you be circumcised. All right. Now, if we turn back to verse 1 there, God gives a command to Abraham. He says, Walk before me and be thou upright. Very important. He's essentially telling Abraham, constitute yourself as a congregation set out from the ways of this world. You're not going to walk like the world, talk like the world, think like the world, act like the world. In other words, you're going to be the church. And he says, I will make a covenant with you, and the covenant will be with you and your seed after thee, which has a bit of a dual meaning here. We're going to circle back around at some point and talk about that. And he gives him a particular right of admission into this church, this fledgling infant church. He gives him a right of admission into that, which is the sign of circumcision. He says that if any child or man among you is found uncircumcised, he will be cut off from his people. You can read a little bit further down in Genesis 17 to find that exact reference, maybe verse 14. Yes, verse 14 says that. Okay, so here we have the institution of a covenant between God and Abraham, a commission to Abraham to be a congregation set apart to the Lord, or literally a church, and a right of admission into said assembly or congregation. Okay, so the typical Christian exposition, in fact, the unchallenged, like Roman, Protestant, Eastern, doesn't matter. They all agree. The church begins in Genesis 17. Dispensationalists in America today are the only dissenters from that idea. They want to find the church's beginning in Acts chapter 2. I think they're wrong, and they are in a very tiny little minority category all by themselves, and not finding the church to have its existence began in Genesis 17. It's only with the churches having its existence begin in Genesis 17 that we can make sense out of the passages we read earlier in Psalms, where we're literally reading, I will praise your name in the church, spoken about 1000 BC, and on and on and on it went. Another passage that would seem confirmatory of this, I'm going to turn over to Exodus chapter 19. In Exodus chapter 19, I'm going to read verses 5 and 6. Yeah.
Talk about Zionism, even if they don't call it by that name, back to verse 8 of 17. And I will give unto thee that seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, and everlasting, for an everlasting possession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly one of our actual major points. When we finish with point 2, then point three in our entire study is proper interpretation of the promises of Abraham about land in Genesis 12 and 17. Yeah, so we're going to return to those. Actually, we're probably going to spend the entirety of next week on those. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if not to put your question off, but we have 1 or 2 more verses here. Yeah, we'll finish with these couple of verses because it's 10 to 8. So we'll finish with these couple of verses on this topic, and then next week we're going to spend literally the whole week on that. Because that was why I threw that out in my usual cynical nature earlier, saying that early Zionism did not have a particular affinity for any piece of land, but then the idea occurred to them, guys, we could tap into this. Now Paul interprets in Galatians 3. Paul interprets Genesis 17. He tells us how to read it. He says, the promise was not made unto the seed as many, but unto the seed as one. This seed is Christ. The promises are in him. There particularly, Paul is speaking of the promises that were made to the church through Abraham. But you have to understand that Abraham, and I am straying into answering your question a little bit, even though I just said I wasn't. Can't help myself. Abraham is two things. Abraham is a real physical human being who was a Hebrew and who had real physical children. Also, you should know that Isaac and Ishmael weren't all of his children. He went on to have other children after them. Ishmael had many, many children who all laid claim to Abraham's lands, and Isaac went on to have many, many grandsons. Okay, so God said, I will make you a father of many nations. This was literally fulfilled in the children that were born to him by Sarah, Sarah's handmaiden, and he had a couple of other wives as well. So these various women bore him many children. I think he rounded up. Most extra-biblical records say that he had either 7 or 8 sons by the time he was all said and done having children. But most all of these men became the leaders of nations. Like the Ishmaelites became their own nation. Isaac became Jacob and Esau. Jacob became Israel. Esau became Edom. These other sons became fathers of some of the other nations that would dwell around Edom and Israel and Ishmael's children, who became but in that day they had a particular name. One of the nations that they're always dealing with are Ishmael's children. But anyway, not overly important. Okay, so there's promises given to Abraham as a physical man. Then there's promises given to Abraham as the head of the church. Okay, so you have to divide those two things, because the promises made to Abraham, insofar as he's the head of the church and the father of the seed of Christ, those promises are made literally to Christ, which is what Paul says in Galatians 3. Those promises are completely inviolable. But then the promises that are made to him as an earthly father are, of course, viable promises. That is to say that they follow the same pattern of all of God's promises, which is the pattern of Deuteronomy 28, that if you're faithful to my ways, and I will bless you in according with my promises. If you are wicked and apostate, I will curse you. Okay, Christ, all of the prophets came to the Israelites preaching that message. Return to the ways of the Lord, and he'll bless you in accordance with the promises given to your first father Abraham. If you consist and continue in your wickedness, then God will destroy you. And Christ's ministry had the exact same promise, because what were Christ's last public words to the Jews? Right? On his way into Jerusalem, Christ goes up to the fig tree, right? And he says, bring forth fruit. Right? And what's the fig tree here? It's the nation of Israel. And he says, bring forth fruit. And he curses it. He says, cursed are you. And his apostles, understanding what he's just done, cursing the nation of Israel, they marvel at this. And he says, this is no great thing. Greater mountains than these shall be cast into the sea with faith. Right? And what he's literally saying there is, you think Israel is an obstacle to the proclamation of the gospel? Greater mountains than this, or nations, are alluding to Isaiah 4, the different mountains as different nations, or the different nations as mountains. The mountain of the Lord, the Lord's people, the Lord's nation shall be lifted up. He says, whole mountains will be cast into the sea, making an allusion to people groups. He goes right into Jerusalem, same chapter in Matthew 22, leading right into Matthew 23. He says, how many times would I have called y'all to repentance, but you wouldn't? He says, the promises of God are being taken away from you and given to a people who will bear the fruits thereof. He gives them the parables, right, of the king who destroys the rebellious city, and of the man who throws the wedding feast and casts out the guests who won't come and calls in new guests. And then it goes over to Matthew 23, and he says, wicked Jerusalem, who has slain the prophets, your desolation has come unto you, and you're left empty and void. Right? So all of Matthew 22 and 23 is this elaborate, Christ begins with this sort of significant symbolic act of cursing the fig tree. And then he tells the apostles, greater mountains than this will be moved out of the way. And then he goes right into Jerusalem, picks a fight with the Jewish leaders and says, wicked, 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 God's taking everything away from you and giving it to somebody else. So what you have there is that the nation of Israel has belonged to the church since they both began as institutions. Abraham was the father of Israel as a nation, and he was the father of the church as an institution. And throughout the Old Testament, the nation of Israel belonged to the church. Christ said, I will call other nations into the church, and I will cast you out of the church. It's not that the church is going to begin. He's saying they both began with your father Abraham. You think you have exclusive rights to belong to the church? I'm going to show you something else. You're going to get thrown out of the church, and every other nation in the world is going to come into the church before you're allowed back in. That's what Paul literally says in Romans 9 through 11. When he says all the Gentiles are going to come into the church before the Jews come back in. So when the church as an institution began to be, and when the nation of Israel began to be, they were separate institutions. Abraham was the visible father of both, but they were separate things. They just happened to run on a parallel course according to God's plan. But then with the preaching of Christ, Christ's preaching was that his message would go forth through all the world. So he tells the Jews, you think you're going to stand in the way of that? No, you're going to be cast out. Because of your wickedness, the promises which are made unto you as a physical people through Abraham as your physical forefather, those promises are null and void. You've been wicked. Your promises are viable in accordance with Deuteronomy 28. I'll cast you out of the land. I'll drive you away. Get out of my face. Throw you away. But then the promises which are given to the church as a spiritual institution are literally made with Christ. And because even though those promises are technically viable promises, right? Like they could be broken. But who is the man who never sits in the seat of the scornful? Who is the man that never walks in the way of the wicked? Of course, Christ. So because Christ is the public person in whom all the promises of God are made on behalf of the church, and Christ is perfect, then we have blessed assurance that Christ, unlike the wicked Jews of his own day, will never break the terms of the promises given to the church. The church can rest assured in the promises that are given to her, because Christ will always be faithful, because he fulfills the requirements of Psalm 1 and many other places. Whereas the Jewish leadership of their day lost their promises and their rights because they were wicked. And Christ said, all of these things will be taken from you and given to somebody else who will bring forth the fruits thereof. So that would be the short answer to your question. Or I said I wasn't going to answer that, but if that makes sense. We're going to look at that in more detail. But you have to see Abraham as the father of Israel as a physical nation and the father of the church as a spiritual institution. We're going to go through places in the Old Testament where sometimes Israel is spoken to as a physical nation. Sometimes it's spoken to as a spiritual institution of the church. You have to be careful. People read this without any skill. And so they'll be looking at, like, for instance, Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is one of my favorite places. And it says, God is in the midst of the city of the Lord, and she will never be moved. Is this speaking of the nation of Israel, a physical people, or is it speaking of the church as a spiritual institution? Yes, exactly. So it's clearly speaking to the church. It's only speaking to Abraham's descendants in accordance with Paul's words in Romans 2, Romans 9, other passages where he says he is a Jew who is one spiritually inwardly, not only outwardly. These are also confusing passages from Paul. They're not quite as cut and dried as they would maybe seem to be. We're going to need to look at those things in their turn next week. But I have one final Bible verse here from Exodus 19 that I would like to read. Exodus 19, we're going to read verses 5 and 6. And it says this. Now, therefore, if you will hear my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be my chief treasure above all people through all the earth be mine. Ye shall be unto me as a kingdom of priests. Ye shall be a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Now, I quote that verse in conclusion because this verse appears somewhere else. If you keep my covenant, then you will be my chief treasure. You will be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Where else do we read that?
Revelation 1:6.
Okay, well, that's not even what I was thinking of. I was thinking of 1 Peter.
1 Peter 2:5.
Yeah, so it's in two places. Yeah, Kirk, yeah, exactly. You were more thorough than I had been. I was just thinking of the place in 1 Peter. Okay, but these words are literally applied to the church in the New Testament. So when these words are spoken by God in the Old Testament, those exact same words, obviously quoting in the New Testament, being quoted in the New Testament, are applied to the church, right? So there's not some distinction or difference being made. The New Testament is quoting this to say this is the exact same thing, right? They don't have to explain themselves when they do that. They say, don't forget, you're the church. Just like the church in Moses' day that Stephen preached about in Acts 7, just like the church then was a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, You're still a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The church has changed in that it used to be that the only nation in the church was the nation of Israel. Now every nation comes unto the church. But just because things have changed a little bit in that sense, don't think the church is not fundamentally what it still was in Exodus 19, which is a kingdom of priests. So it's important when we read passages like Kirk pointed out in Revelation 2, the one that I was getting at in 1 Peter, the apostles understood the church to have been something that existed all the way back to Abraham's day. That was what they saw as the beginning of the church. So let's see, we talked about under point 2 there, the church is a unified body in history. It did not begin at Pentecost. We looked at New Testament verification of that. Reading through Murray, we looked at the usage of the term for church throughout the scriptures. We looked at the origin of the church in the Old Testament. And then my last point was that to properly understand the church in the Old Testament, we must understand what Israel was as a nation and how Israel was the church. And we covered that a little bit with regard to Marty's question. So that wraps up point 2. And next week, we'll move into talking about point 3, which is specifically how the promises of land and seed and all that are made to Abraham and what sense they're made to Abraham and how all of that works out. And that'll, under that, we'll cover the nature of the promises given in the Old Testament, conditionality of the promises, New Testament expositions of the relationship between Israel and the church. And then in conclusion, we will take a look at we probably won't get to this next week because next week we're going to spend the whole time talking about what I just said. And then in the last section of this study is a better understanding of charges of replacement theology, right? You see that, like, for instance, there's this guy, I know Mike likes him a little bit. Mike Deeb likes him a little bit, Michael Brown. And Michael Brown's not a bad theologian in every sense of the word, but Michael Brown has this Michael Brown's a Jewish fellow, and he has this really irritating way of constantly accusing every Christian of being an anti-Semite who believes in, quote, replacement theology. And this is an entire crock of crap because the only way you can get at the idea of replacement theology is if you make Brown as a dispensationalist, of course, and he is assuming the idea that the church began in Acts 2 and that the Jews were the people of God from Genesis 17 to Acts 1, and then the church was created in Acts 2, and in Brown's idea, if you allow the church to supersede the Jews, then you're some sort of an anti-Semite. But he's assuming all these things, so like he has all these debates with people in which he's refuting something that's a product of assumptions that he's made upstream. So like his debate partners, if they're not dispensationalists, they don't even have those assumptions, right? Like if you believe like we do that the church is one in all ages and nations come under the church and nations are kicked out of the church like ours is fitting to be if we keep rebelling, then you don't share Michael Brown's assumptions that the Jews are sort of like one special religious group over here and the church is another group over here. And hey guys, don't mix them up because if you do, I'm going to accuse you of being an anti-Semite. So Brown just has all this baggage that comes in with his poor understanding of just what the church is. And he gets into all these debates where he's debating with people who don't share his particular incorrect nuances with what he thinks about the church is. And it leads to a whole lot of confusion. And like I meet all these people who are like, you know, they like Brown is really popular. And I meet all these people, and they're like, oh, so-and-so's an anti-Semite because he debated with Brown and they defended replacement theology. It's like, well, they don't believe replacement theology. Brown has created this category of replacement theology to fit people that don't even believe in his pre-established assumptions. Like, just because they don't fit into Brown's box and don't even think the way he does about them. Like, Brown has this division that's downstream of some false points that he accepted way back up here. This fork in the river that Brown needs to find between replacement theology on one side and what he considers to be an acceptable church-Israel relationship on the other side. This whole fork is completely obviated if you just never even went that way to begin with. If the church is one in all ages, then you never even get to this place where Brown's like, are you a replacement theologist? Yeah, exactly. So if you accept the idea that the church is one in all ages, and when Paul talks about the grafting, he's talking about the propriety of nations within the church. And Paul is sort of looking forward, and he's saying, you know, hey, the Israelite nation has been kicked out of the church because they're unfaithful. But God is about to bring in the Greek nation and the Latin nation and the German nation and the Gaelic nation and the Anglo nation. And all of these nations are going to come into the church. You know, and as I frequently quote with Paul, he has these sort of, you know, rhapsodies. He goes on and on and on, you know, and he says, and all these nations are going to come into the church until one day every nation is going to be in the church, and the Israelite nation is going to be the only nation that's not in the church, and then the Holy Spirit's finally going to fall upon them with power, and they're going to come back into the church, and then everybody's going to be in the church, right? So that's Paul's sort of like super brief overview of the entirety of how the gospel is going to go forward in the New Testament times. And that, you know, the apostles frequently spoke that way. They weren't as much interested in like individuals coming into the church as they looked at whole nations. So they saw these nations as covenanting with God, becoming part of his visible church. And so, you know, Paul says the Jewish nation has been pushed out of the church because they're wicked. And all these other nations are going to come into the church, and then the Jewish nation is going to come back into the church at some point. It's theirs by right because they were there first. They've been kicked out because of their wickedness, but they're going to come back in the future. And that's the traditional understanding. And when you have that understanding, it just sort of circumvents all of Brown's little categories that he wants to put everybody in. It's like, oh, you're anti-Semitic and you know, you're acceptable and all this. And it gets very confusing because he's making these assumptions that like 99% of Christians in history don't make to begin with.
It almost leads me to think that the Jews would have a different way of coming into the kingdom.
Well, a lot of really hardcore dispensationalists believe that. That's a point of contention. Like, to his credit, Brown doesn't believe that, okay? Like, Brown works hard to see Jews evangelized. I like Brown for that. I guess I don't have a grudge against Brown. This is something where he gets on my nerve. Brown does some good things. But, you know, like a lot of people like John Hagee, who I pick on a lot, I'm just familiar with his stuff. John Hagee will tell you it's wrong to preach Christ to the Jews. They have another way of coming to God. And to that, I say away with him. Like, I will pick on Hagee for that. He's a heretic. That's no gospel at all. I mean, the Bible gives you numerous warnings of anybody who talks like that. This person is an antichrist. So people like Mark Biltz, who talks that way, John Hagee, who talks that way, I'm not afraid they're antichrist. That's just antichrist. I can't have common cause with that. But people like Michael Brown, who I don't have like a ton of respect for Michael Brown, but he is generally solid on a few things. And he's not a bad, I think he's a good guy. I do. I've seen enough of his stuff. I think he has like a good heart. He wants to, you know, he's a Jew, and he has a heart for other Jews. And I get that. There's, you know, blood loyalty there. That's cool. I like that. And he genuinely wants to see other Jews come to Christianity. I have a lot of respect for him in that way. But he has all these sort of like half-baked debates with people where he doesn't really seem to get the fact that it's like, Mike Brown, there is a bigger world in this ghetto that you live in. And you're like mad that some people don't live on your street in the ghetto. Like, they just have a nicer neighborhood altogether. Don't be mad. Read a book or something. I mean, he's a super intelligent guy. I'm not making fun of him, but I watch these things on YouTube. It's very infuriating. I just want to go into like a fourth wall break and like have him read a book on this one thing. And it's like, stop making a fool of yourself, my dude. But unfortunately, he's kind of old now. It'll probably never happen. He'll just keep having these debates and calling people anti-Semites and all that sort of thing. So I'm sometimes glad that I'm not like a minority, so that I never attempted to do that. It's very irritating. Like when you just have an honest intellectual debate with somebody and lose the debate and they'd be like, well, you're racist. Like, can we not do that? Like, the dude admitted to debate with you. Okay, so he's probably not a racist. You know, like, can we have an intellectual discussion that does not involve, you're a racist? It's the most shop war and tiring thing ever. Just stop. Okay, you're a Jew. You can tap into the fact that the SBCL and the ADL and the Simon Wiesenthal Center and all of them get like hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So, like, you know, get your money that's coming your way because you're not a white guy. Just stop calling everybody racist. It's just very irritating. But anyway, we're going to just stop that there.